In this video, I want to talk about Chapter 1 of Alison Brisk's work, her book, The Future of Human Rights. And so Chapter 1 is called Now More Than Ever, and it breaks up into a number of sections. But the main sort of thrust of this chapter is to sort of get the ball rolling, come up with this. She starts off with this sort of big conception of human rights and is going to frame it as less as a philosopher would frame it. So this is a little bit different for me to talk about this, but more in an activist kind of line, more as a practitioner, shall we say. Okay, so let's just jump right in and see what Brisk has to say about this. Okay, so she, as I said, she starts off with this kind of big picture, human rights. And unlike Griffin or whatever, who's very careful about laying down sort of necessary conditions, sufficient conditions, and arguing for a very tight conceptualization in places, sometimes he's a little looser, but nonetheless, he's trying to give more of a philosopher's definition. This one's big, right? So what are human rights? Well, it's like a set of principles, values, and then she talks about human rights as institutions seeking life, dignity, equality, etc., of all people. So, and none of these terms are really defined. It's just like this big, human rights is a big job, right? You can think of it like that. It's a big endeavor. And I think that's sort of the key kind of governing idea, that human rights are not, as we'll see a little later, they're not like strictly doctrine, right? There's something in motion about these things. They're the products of communication and construction, and we construct these kinds of rights. Okay, anyways, and so what's also, human rights, of course, are connected to freedom from oppression, right? So we're all life and dignity, freedom from oppression. Human rights are also connected and bound up with duties of authorities, right? Governments, power holders like employers. And if governments and power holders can't handle certain things, then there are duties also of the international community. So that's a certain take on notions. Right away, we can see that's going to be a take on notions of sovereignty. Like if human rights are being abused, sovereignty may go out the window, or sovereignty and human rights they're going to be they could be in some kind of tension. It's not that sovereignty, as in older models, would dominate, right? Okay, so and these duties of authorities are basically looking at providing basic elements of human life and protection, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on in this. Now, in the chapter, she also, talks about the rise of rights, where they come from, and it's a fairly, shall we say, a pretty short little version of it. And I don't think that's really what her main interest is. I think what her main interest is to is to sort of illustrate, well, now more than ever, right? It's like, okay, what's going on? Is there some big problem here? Yes, there essentially is. Rights have been rising for a long time, and then in the 20th century, there seems to be sort of this pitfall, that these pitfalls start emerging, and there's a kind of tension that Brisk talks about. That yes, on the one hand, good story would be that there has been a large-scale spread of human rights, and if you look, human rights discourse is certainly more prevalent than it ever was. Everybody's talking about human rights, to the point of, if you recall in my Griffin lectures, he was worried about, calling everything a human right, and there's problems with that. But nonetheless, people are much more aware of human rights, talking about them more around the globe. We talk about human rights all over the place. Yes, that's true, but at the same time, there's still millions of people in the world that do not enjoy human rights, and there's the rise of not only rights, but kind of a backlash, perhaps, or alongside with things opening up in particular parts of the world, there's increasing levels of authoritarianism around the world. We see a lot of that. I'm always hearing reports about, democracy is kind of ebbing and flowing, and sometimes it's ebbing as authoritarian governments emerge, or democracies, as she points out, some of them are seem to be less and less interested in pushing human rights amongst their own citizens and less around the world. Sure, I mean, you can point to instances of that. I'll stay out of the political examples, but we can think about that, and that's her concern. And this is written a number of years ago, so she, Brisk is not talking about anything necessarily that we'd see today, but it's a general trend. Okay, so all right, so you've got this tension, right? Um, well, okay, what do we make of it, right? What should we conclude? She says. Should we see human rights of, well, it was good while it lasted, kind of came up, and then there's this sort of countervailing tendency, and maybe human rights are just exhausted. They've run their course. This is as far as they're going to get, and the best days for human rights are behind us. That's possible. Or you might say, no, 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 they're here, they're resilient, and there's going to be kind of an ebb and flow of them, sure. And you always got to be careful that what you may think is a long-term trend is a short-term trend. Yeah, there's been some setbacks, but you know what? Human rights are resilient. They're around. You really can't, you can sort of push them back a little bit, but they're going to eventually be pushed forward again. And of course, there's no shortage of criticisms of human rights. I've got a video on the human right to dominate. Check that out. There's lots of criticisms about human rights, namely that it's kind of a corrupted political discourse, that it's intrinsically, intrinsically Western and kind of quasi-imperialist, that human rights really, what they've done is really have granted governments, in fact, more powers, because they not only just have, monetary power and legal powers, now they get moral powers, and they become incredibly, and under this justification, we're looking after human rights, so we can basically kind of do anything in the name of human rights. So there's no shortage of criticisms of them, and she lays out a few of them. You can have a look. That is all bad stuff out of the Enlightenment, and so there's a lot of standard kind of anti-rationalist and anti-Enlightenment kinds of things, and a variety of criticisms of these things. She lists a few of them. Doesn't go into too much depth. Have a look, though. Now, she offers sort of this response, and she quotes some major thinkers responding to these criticisms, and says, well, look, there's doctrinal problems, sure, and all that, but we need a pragmatic response to this. Namely, that the idea, in theory, they're right, but they have gone wrong. They've been skewed in practice, no question there. So this response is sort of putting the block up. They're not intrinsically a bad idea, as some people want to argue, but there's no question that they can be misused. Just like any rule, any law, if it gets into the wrong hands, it can be abused. And human rights, the discourse of human rights, is no exception. So human rights should be thought less of not doctrine, but more as a constructive political process that questions things, that's constantly questioning political programs, because it too is a kind of political program, but one that questions other political programs. So always asking questions like, what is right? What are we talking about? What has value? What are we trying to protect? And of course, what counts as human? Right? That's always important, is to keep our eye on what exactly it counts as human, because we are talking about human rights. So it's a constructive political process that's done in dialogue. It's a movement. It's not some sort of fixed doctrine that you're, like philosophers, a lot of us like to sort of lay these conditions, necessary and sufficient conditions down. Oh yeah, we start off, as Socrates always said, what's your definition of, or what do you mean by, and that governs the conversation. And Brisk is saying that we don't really want to do that, because we are trying to have human rights for a dynamic, active, changing society, a changing world. So it's going to be more of a movement, not doctrine. And it's always a movement with a direction towards accountability, empowerment, freedom, dignity, and equality for all persons. Again, this is sort of like this big sort of thing she laid out at the beginning of it. Now, this political sort of process, this political program, as she sometimes calls it, is facing three main challenges, right? Three dimensions or three challenges, which I indicate with this little asterisk. One is this governance gap, because there's a tension, right, in this world order between state sovereignty and human rights, because human rights in the international thing is anchored in state institutions. So the protection of human rights is not like there isn't a super state or that governs human rights around the world. It's anchored in these kinds of agreements between states, and that can be, as she said, renders the protection of human rights a little haphazard. So there's a gap between a lot of norms that are articulated and compliance, and basically every country, every state, whatever, every jurisdiction always claims to be in favor of human rights, and many of them just simply you look at them and you say that doesn't look like being you're in favor of. You're certainly not complying with what you say you are or what you hold as a belief. So that's we got to close that governance gap. Expanding rights, around from more diverse groups have to be brought in, and linking rights to environmental issues, right? That's a big thing. Of course, when Brisk was writing this is a little earlier, several years ago, but now, of course, everyone talks about linking certain kinds of human rights to environmental rights. You damage the environment, people don't have good lives in a region where the environment is really damaged, and the environment of a local environment can be damaged by what people do elsewhere. So there is a large scale application of linking human rights, to a decent life like clean water or something, to what people do elsewhere, maybe in a very distant country. So that kind of expanding how rights are talked about has to be linked up to all kinds of things, and that's a real challenge, she says, to do. And then, of course, going back to this sort of tension up here with the pitfalls and all that, is as rights expand, there's always a backlash or resistance or whatever you want to call it. And that's another thing that has to be addressed, is to be able to really formulate and contest those that contest human rights. So contesting what rights resistance, right? Now, this is where, how are we going to do that? We have to construct a kind of political program, a process, with all this continual questioning for the future of human rights to push back against this. Now, how do we do that? She closes the chapter giving you some examples, and some of them are fairly obvious. They're not easy to do, but they're obvious. Things like speaking out, right? People have to be aware of these things. Public awareness campaigns, and addressing this. And the other one is the notion of following money, where you as an individual try to govern your economic power according to pushing back on these three challenges, and following the money, right? So pressuring governments to follow the money of rights resistance or whatnot, and seeing if you can weaken these kinds of opposition to the spread of human rights. And this general construction of a political program will help meet these challenges. And in some, she says, the way forward, it's going to be, again, it's kind of like this tension, right? You're going to have things sometimes get better, sometimes get worse. It's going to be a dialectical one. In other words, you win some, you lose some. But overall, the thing keeps going forward. But it is a back and forth. It's not going to just be, endless green lights and away you go. There's going to be some red lights and stop signs, but you're nonetheless going to keep going and keep pushing. And this dialectic will go back and forth. But the goal is always the same, towards accountability, empowerment, freedom, dignity, and equality. So that's basically the notion of human rights as a movement and the construction of a social program, a social political program to meet these kinds of challenges. See you next video.